Hello everybody. Okay, so this is the first video in my vlog series. I decided that the best place to start would be history. Before anything else, let's know what comes from where. Now, one problem that I had when deciding how I was going to do this history video was simply that paganism as a whole is the original religion. It consists of animism and totemism and shamanism, so there is no way to actually trace something before recorded history. So what I ran into there is I cannot trace the beginning of paganism, because the beginning of paganism is also along with the birth of mankind, because it was the original religion. What I can, however, do is go through the current history through to what we believe to be the beginning of Wicca, and when we get to the beginning specifically of Wicca, I will say, and here's where it diverges into ancient religions and we lose ourselves in the entire world of shamanism, animism, and totemism, which, just so you know, essentially everything has a life or a spirit. Animals are deities, stars are deities, heavenly bodies are deities. It's a long, long list of things that can be considered holy, or gods, or magic, or anything else that you may have on the religious spectrum. To actually go to the beginning of paganism would mean that we would throw out, even if we threw out all of the philosophy religions, the ones that are less about deities and more about the personal self, like Buddhism, for example, if we threw those out and we threw out the monotheistic religions, we'd still be left with literally thousands of religions. So what we are doing is focusing on one, and it happens to be the one that I practice, yes, but I will show you essentially where it comes from. I have an excessive list of what we need to cover, and I'm going to try to get it as concise as possible. Starting with modern day Wicca, it is essentially based off of Gardnerian paganism, which was made into its current form by Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valentine. They are both British, and they are both fairly recently deceased. They started doing their work in the 50s, and neither of them stopped till the day they died. What I'm going to talk about with them is essentially hitting on the points that they are known as the father for Gerald and the mother for Doreen of Wicca. They are known as the parents of the craft because they brought the most public attention into it. In Great Britain in 1951, the final anti-witchcraft law was repealed, and so there was kind of a big boom of what we would now refer to as New Age businesses and New Age religious movements, and they are essentially summed up by Gerald's group, which he is pretty well credited with coining the term Wicca, which he did not invent, but he is the one credited with making it a mainstream word. He's seen as the male originator of the how do you say it? Not branch, but denomination. Denomination of the craft. He himself, not a very reputable character, but he knew everyone who was anyone, and he was very, very open in the press. A lot of pagans today see him as a kind of father figure to the craft, and a lot see him as someone who did a lot of things wrong, who kind of bastardized the religion. And it's not as though he did anything crazy with the religion, it's that he was greatly, greatly assisted by both Aleister Crowley and Doreen Valentine, who he attempted to take credit for both of their work, actually. With him, it was more of a publicity thing. He, according to Doreen Valentine, seemed much more interested in publicity and self-aggrandizing than he did in the religion. So, wanting it to be known that while he is seen as the father of the craft, he had quite some trouble with himself personally, and initially got into it actually as a work of fiction. So, like, he literally wrote a fiction book, and after writing the book, he decided that he would learn more about the religions, and then decided that he would become a follower of them and a practicer of them. And his initial rituals, his initial ritual working was actually based on his work of fiction, which was largely based on actual folklore, but the fact of the matter is, as you can tell, I'm one of the pagans who don't see him as a very reputable character. However, he is the one who brought Doreen Valentine out into the public light, and they started their working relationship in roughly 1953. Doreen Valentine actually, looked through his Book of Shadows and credited a lot of the things he had written to Aleister Crowley, and she also amended many of the things he wrote, elaborating on his rituals to make them actually effective, more ritualistic. She put depth and she put structure into what he had, which was very, very fragmented, because he, while he was for some time seen as the foremost authority on Wicca, he in fact did not do a very good job, despite making many covens, of which he was overall in charge of. Once Doreen Valentine was made a high priestess in his coven, he had made such a media fire around Wicca, he had made it so aggrandized in the newspapers, on the television, radio, and all that. She had decided that, and made a public statement, that he was, let me see actually what she specifically stated. Yeah, she believed that he was not being true to the religion. She believed that he was actually doing harm to his teachings and harm to the religion as a whole by being so public with it, by trying to turn it into this commercialized entity. So essentially what you had here was Doreen Valentine, who had been practicing magic on her own, learning on her own, since the age of 7. When she was discovered to be practicing, she actually was sent to a convent by her parents, and when she was 15 she left the convent, never to return to the convent, to her parents, or to Christianity, and wound up being the founding mother of modern day Wicca. So, quite proud of her. I think if I have an idol in the craft, it would be her. what she did was take emphasis away from the hocus pocus sort of magic, and she said, we need ritual magic, we need simplistic magic, we need basics, and we need purpose for what we do. Now, her emphasis got changed from the magic aspect to the religion aspect, where she felt it needed to be. And as a religion, I think, should indeed be. What happened with that was she put heavy emphasis on the mother goddess figure, and that is where we are in modern day Wicca right now, essentially, is what with Doreen Valentine left us with. And now going to what actually inspired the current day's Wicca, which is still based on what Doreen Valentine did, her work from between the late 50s and all the way up until 1999 when she died. She, very soon before her death, actually made yet another public statement about the progress of the pagan Reformation, which is what I like to call it, because we went from individual family practices that were secret all throughout Europe to a worldwide religion, and I think that's quite impressive. But her final public statement I have here was, let me see, we have literally spread worldwide. We are a creative and fertile movement. We have inspired art, television, music, and historical research. We have lived down calamity and abuse. We have survived treachery. So it seems to me that the powers that be must have purpose for us in this Aquarian age that is coming to be. So mote be. She was a very strong, independent woman. She achieved quite a bit of fame in her community. She was a public figure for a good time, and she was a very successful high priestess. She was well studied, I wouldn't say inspired, but very well studied in Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was a famous occultist back in the day who was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was essentially an occultist organization that began in 1888. I did have to look down to check that date. But it is credited today as the largest knowledge bank of occult and generally pagan information that we have seen in the modern world. It combines the traditional European style of paganism, which the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn has its roots in Germany, so it's more of a Germanic kind of paganism, as opposed to Wicca, which is more of a Italian kind of paganism, and we'll get to that in the future. But they took their inspiration from the European paganism that they started with. They moved it to essentially a Judeo-Christian mysticism kind of thing. Books of Enoch and the Keys of Solomon were a heavy influence to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, so they ended up mixing their pagan beliefs with the Judeo-Christian forms of magic, relying heavily on either angels or demons, what have you. And essentially, for a long time, anyone who was anyone had some relation to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And I don't believe that is as much the case today, because we have, when I say we, I mean pagans as a whole, not specifically Wiccans, have become so widespread, but the organization's entirety was kept secret pretty much, more or less, until a book was published in 1937 by a member of this order who, in his mind, had not broken his vows of secrecy to the order, but as you can imagine, that didn't turn over very well with the order itself. The book was called The Golden Dawn, and it was essentially a compilation of much of the knowledge that this organization had. But most notably, I think the biggest thing that this organization did was produce Aleister Crowley, who is one of the most noted occultists in modern time. I would argue himself and Doreen Valentine and Gerald Gardner are the most famous pagans. Not currently living, but I would argue they're the most famous in this movement of getting it restarted. Also, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn came to America before the Wiccan movement did. It came to America in 1977, and it actually started in Columbus, Georgia, of all places. So I was personally surprised to find out that this organization in America had its beginnings in Georgia. Once again, its actual beginnings were in Germany at an undisclosed date, but the order itself was officially founded in 1888. So this order's knowledge had greatly helped the pagan movement that was going on in Great Britain, which eventually spread to the rest of Europe. And what was going on with this organization, Aleister Crowley and Doreen Valentine were both inspired by this man's name that I cannot pronounce. Charles Leland. I want to say Leland. Leland. He was an American of Dutch descent, I believe, and he did all of his publishing in the mid to late 1800s. He was actually a Princeton graduate, and his father paid for his graduate schooling in Europe after he graduated from Princeton. And he wound up becoming sort of the original American pagan, if you will. He has written a lot of books on gypsies, who he frequently associated with, and was eventually accepted as a gypsy despite not being born or raised as one. Born and raised pretty affluently, actually. He was sort of the one who brought forth the statement that the cult of Diana was the origins of Italian witchcraft, which is where we are now going to jump to. And a witch is strega. That's how you would say witch. But it doesn't mean specifically what you might think of with witch. It's more of anyone who's a practitioner of witchcraft, and your term for the person will vary depending on where you're practicing, actually, because witchcraft in Italy is very regional. It's very regional, obviously, because Rome's size kept shifting for a good several centuries, and then it wound up being the main base of Christianity. So with this, it's time to go a little bit into the Inquisitions, because that is where the cult of Diana was first really brought to light. I'm sorry, not they, I say as they as though every member who worshipped Diana and the entire thing was caught. No. Two high priestesses from two separate covens of this cult, and also subsequently most of their covens, were arrested and executed for witchcraft, and they were brought before Inquisitioner Milian in 1384 and 1390. What happened in this trial essentially is they said, no, we do not worship the devil, we are not Satanist, we're not Christian either. They were asked what they were, and they said they worshipped the goddess Diana. Well, immediately the church said, you are evil witches, you will be burned. They tortured these women to get the names of their coven mates, and they hunted them down too. This is the information that we derived from them, the information that we derived from Charles, and the information that we derived from modern-day family practitioners, such as Raymond Buckland, who's a pretty notable pagan author today, still living. His last book was published in 2004. What we see here is they took, I wish we could pause this because I need a drink of water, goodness. We find that their covens ranged from 9 to 13 members. The significance of the 13 cutoff was that in a full year there can be up to 13 moons, full moons that is, and Diana was a moon goddess and credited as the Queen of Witches, or as the original witch, or as the mother to the original witch, depending on which mythology you want to look at. There is not a concise, specific mythology to it because, well, usually the information on it would be burned. So we're kind of playing a historical catch-up here, and I hate to use a term like that, but it's the truth. We're playing historical catch-up when we go to this. And out of these covens of 9 to 13, there were only one male allowed. Now, the church, I don't know for how long they had this policy, but for a while, if you were convicted of witchcraft, it meant that you were also a sodomist, because the mindset was women have sex with the devil because they're innately weak to lust. They think carnal thoughts, they're too weak to resist. And having read a bit of the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a popular, it was the second most popular book in the world, actually, second only to the Bible, for quite some time. It was a book on hunting down heretics and how to test them if they were heretics, and what ways to torture them to get what sort of information, and how to execute them afterwards. It's known as the witch hunting book because despite being geared towards all heretics, it was pretty specifically hunting down witches. Now, in this, they say that most male witches are homosexuals. They say that it's inferred that you are a sodomist because you would have to have carnal relations with the devil. That was a big source of magic to the Christians of the time. They thought that sexual relations with demons was required for using magic because they thought demons were required for magic. Obviously, if you go to my religion, or most any version of paganism, you'll see that that's not the case, but to the Christians, they believed this. So a lot of why paganism is associated with homosexuality in modern day and in fan fiction is not only because we have no taboo against it, not only because we don't encourage it, but depending on which mythology you want to look at, there are active examples of unpunished homosexuality. So I think that's where it blended with the church. They said if women have to have sex with the devil and men practice this, the men must do it too. That's where that comes from, but essentially we don't have a real level of understanding. Were these men actually homosexual, or were they just doing it for ritual? Did they ever do it at all? Is it simply a relation to the fact that they would be virginal since they were in a cult of a virgin goddess? Diana being a virgin goddess, she's her Greek equivalent is Artemis. It's not very clear when we look through the church's records, which is whose records we have to look through. We're either trusting long-standing family tradition or we're trusting church records. As you can see, There's bias in either one. Now, this cult of Diana, as it's currently referred to, has existed, documented from 116 BC. It's heavily associated with the city of Varro, Varro. It's said to be as old as the city, which is why I mentioned that. That's what we're judging our age marker on, is the city which it supposedly originated in. The cult of Diana, that is. Cult of Diana also being mentioned in the Bible in letters from Paul. So it's a pretty documented thing. It's just not well documented. We know it existed, and we're playing catch up with what it actually did. Because when you look at specifically worshiping Diana, which if you look at the Roman pantheon, you see that she's pretty much a copy of Artemis, which did precede her. But the problem with that is we're talking about Strega, which has its own mythology for Diana, saying that she split the spirits of, and by spirits I can interchange that with deities or essences of, light and dark apart from each other, which became two separate deities, which would be Apollo and which would be Hecate. Hecate is also known as the Queen of the Witches, and if you go to I believe it's Macbeth who actually writes her in as a human being who is the Witch Queen. But that's from the basis of after Diana splits them, she takes in Hecate, and she becomes the dark feminine aspect of night and womanhood and magic. Whereas she then takes interest in light, which she created by splitting darkness and light. She's now made herself both the mother and the sister of this male light sun deity. And she is attracted to him, and she proceeds to enchant him. One mythology is that she seduces him with her magic. She charms him into falling in lust with her. And the other is that she essentially magically gets him inebriated and he falls asleep and she has her way with him. And out of this union results their child, which I have a hard time pronouncing her name. I usually say Iridia, but it's more like Aradia. And this is the concept of she's the daughter of the Queen of Witches, who's also the moon goddess, who's also the goddess of magic, who's also the goddess of nighttime, who's also a woman goddess. She's all these feminine traits, and her daughter, therefore, is the original witch. And if you look at the alternative mythology to that, Diana comes to Earth and she wishes to teach people the ways of magic, and Aradia is her best student. And in this mythology, she gains huge amounts of knowledge from the goddess, and the goddess leaves the earth and leaves it up to her student Aradia to teach the others, and she is the wisest and strongest witch, and also the truly original witch. And the final thing concerning her is a theory that is not well supported, that she was actually a normal human practicing witch who was living in a town in Italy in 1917 and became a prominent leader of her coven. And she was elevated to god status over time and added to the mythology. That's not out of the question, but that's unlikely when you already have a cult preceding her by, you know, roughly 2,000 years. I'm just giving you the full information. What this cult does is set up the strong female influence and sets up the magical influence. But when we look at the religion that has its first recorded start in 31 BC, you see not specifically her, but most any moon goddess, any goddess of virginity or motherhood, and any goddesses of night and any goddesses of magic. They all seem to blur together in one entity, and originally Diana was not a moon goddess and not a goddess of virginity, but simply a goddess of the hunt, and she dressed and acted like a boy. She was essentially the idea of if a young, strong woman were to behave like a man, we see her as this. And that's kind of how her whole persona was originally built. And over time she became associated with the moon over the Titan Luna. And Titans were a tribe of immortal beings that preceded the gods. Luna used to be the moon, and Artemis kind of precedes her. After that, she takes her place. For some unknown reason, history just decides that Artemis is now the moon, which is understandable considering the Titans are no longer worshipped because the gods have taken them over, you know. So I understand this concept, but that's how the history timeline flows. Now, she gets added on. She's now the goddess of the moon, the goddess of the night, the goddess of magic, the goddess of womanhood, the goddess of virginity. She's stacking up a list. She's still the goddess of hunt and the goddess of animals and the goddess of sacred forests. So she becomes a really powerful figure, and I think that's why specifically the early Christians really targeted her movement, because you'll notice that the church is not fond of a strong woman. They see that as incredibly threatening. They even changed the Holy Spirit from the wisdom of God being Sophia, the woman, or being Chokmah in Jewish. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but I do know it was a female, and yes, it's specifically Chokmah. But the wisdom of God was a female personification separate from the God form himself, and we see that phased out in the monotheistic religion. We see them just merged into one, and it's now the Holy Spirit. It's not Sophia, the embodiment of God's will and his knowledge as a woman. It's just they like to cut out women. It's a very sexist culture, very sexist kind of theology. Not that having your main deity be an absolutely 100% independent female didn't lead to a female bias. I'm just saying that where you see this strong line in delineation is essentially from society's attempt to keep men in the position of power, which is where sociology mixes with the culture, mixes with the religion, it mixes with the history. It's very hard to give the history of the religion in bare bone without giving history around it. So I do apologize for any ranting. After all is said and done, after the cult kind of goes downhill for a while, we don't see or hear anything from them. What happens is that it later reemerges and it has the current day duality of its, instead of polytheistic or monotheistic, it's actually duotheistic, because it is the mother goddess and her horned god, and they're the eternal lovers, and they're represented by sun and moon and day and night. And what you see there is a duality concept of a yin and yang function, as opposed to the cult of Diana function, which was she creates the man and then she seduces the man. You now have their an eternal function that just goes together because it's natural for them to go together, because they're the parents of life, which is totally understandable. But where we have our start in Wicca, specifically Wicca, comes from this twist on the Diana story. And this twist on the Diana story is the start of Strega, which is what modern day Wicca draws its heaviest influence from. But it's not the total beginning quite yet. We're now at a point where male deities are interchangeable with the horn god. I specify that while the horn god isn't definitely associated with one major male deity, he is mainly represented in Kuranos, which is an ancient fertility deity. He is Gaelic in origin, I want to say, and his beginnings are in 500 BC. And Pan, who is another male fertility god, and he is the satyr, which is half man, half goat. Most of the myths involving him, he chases down and has sex with nymphs. He is a virile animal god. And then we draw from Germanic influences, where he is a horned hunter, and he's the god of the wild hunt, and he also collects the souls of the dead. So you die and he would take your soul to the afterworld. That's the three aspects that give the heaviest influence to the horn god figure. But he's pretty popularly overlooked in favor of the mother goddess, who creates him and creates the world and sustains everything. She winds up being the alpha and omega in whatever you look at. But after she creates the horn god, there's this perpetual duality where they always have to be even in some fashion. Because the religion goes, when you die, you die, which is what the horn god covers. He takes your soul from your body. And then you're reborn, which is what the goddess covers, because she's also represented by Cheridwin, who I want to say is Gaelic in origin as well, but I cannot definitively say Gaelic in origin. Point being, she stirs the cauldron of reincarnation. She brings your soul back from the afterworld into your next life. And so, birth, death, reincarnation. That's the eternal cycle that you are locked in if you subscribe to Wiccan theology. And that is the role they fulfill, essentially. Male-female duality. And whereas the horn god would oftentimes represent the physical in something, like he is the physical camera I'm recording on, the goddess would represent the essence of something. So she would be the spirit or the idea or the feeling of the camera. If you cannot touch it, it's represented by her. If you can, it's represented by him. You have perpetual duality. They have to go together. And that's where we are modern time with the theology. But there's too little known about the original theology of this cult, which was pretty soundly crushed during the Inquisition, but reemerged later because, as I say, family traditions are what has kept the craft alive, which also means that unless the family perpetually records the information over and over again from generation to generation to generation, what you have to go on is folklore and the few documents left over. Which is probably why Raymond Buckland, the still living pagan who writes about Strega today, is so popular, because he wanted to come out with his family tradition. And what we have to go on is family traditions. That's what we had to go on in Great Britain. That's what we had to go on in Italy. When your people get subjugated so often, what you have to go on is what people pass down. So I apologize for a lack of proper recording and proper this person did this at this date previous to the last century or so, but at least we've had strong influences within the last definitely within the last 50 years with certainty, but over the last century it's kind of been a quick build-up, especially considering in the 1800s it was an academic journal written in the 1800s, I believe 1862 if I'm not mistaken, that established paganism as the original religion of Great Britain and the original religion of Ireland, which led to the historical study of, gee, I wonder if something happened before we were all Christian, which wasn't a real concept in society and certainly not in academia before that. So we now move back. The earliest recorded reference of a witch, the way we would know it today, a woman who casts spells, would be from Homer and other Greek writer. Hesiod, I want to say is how you pronounce it, but when I say Homer, I mean Homer as in the Odyssey, the famous Greek poet who wrote epic poems and stories. He references witches roughly, well, these two men do, roughly 800 BC, and that's where our original reference of a woman casting spells comes from. But when you want to get down to it, the main beginning of what we consider Wicca came from Strega, which, like I said, had its start in 31 BC. It was covens of almost entirely women, no greater than 13, and it has survived through family traditions and been combined with other mysticisms of other cultures over time until we got to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, who influenced Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valentine, who are the people we owe the modern image of Wicca to. Now, of course, they had their explosion of popularity in Wicca in the 50s and 60s in Great Britain, and it spread throughout Europe roughly that time period. America did not take notice of Wicca culturally until the 1990s, which is when you see movies like The Craft. You get the image of the gothic girl in high school that no one likes. They're always female, there's always something wrong with them, they're always dark, and they're always troubled. Which was, of course, the Protestant spin that America put on it, that it puts on really any religion that comes through our borders. And what happens with that is we've moved from being viewed as gothic and Satan worshippers and crazy people who like to dabble in the dark arts. We've moved from that to the New Age hippie version, where we're perceived as the people who smoke a lot of pot and talk about energy and vibrations, man. You know? So the cultural things we're fighting are no longer you worship Satan. The cultural things we're fighting are the druggy, don't have the mental capability to reason, kind of wave a magic wand because you're on shrooms kind of stereotype, which is absolutely awful, of course, and totally undeserved. But where this comes from is the practice of magic, which will be another video, which I will hopefully shorten, which does indeed happen on the etheric level. It's a practice of energy, not always a practice of something physical. So it's an exertion and a practice of will and meditation and prayer and ritual. You see a lot of concepts that you could probably imagine a stoner going on about, which is why we've moved from the Christianized version of this person is worshiping the devil, and the Gothic version of this person clearly is just a dark person. You know, it comes from the Christian devil went from being the most gorgeous being in all creation, who was just perpetually bathed in light, and he was flawless, and the only thing more perfect than him would have been God. And then what you get is they merge in the idea of the horn god and Pan, and so you see cloven hooves and you see horns, and then they merge in when the concept of hell as an eternal burning torment comes, they merge in, oh, well, it's on fire, he has red skin now. So then you get the red devil with his horns and his goat feet. And after you have the horns and the goat feet and the red skin, you then move on to his pitchfork and his hooked nose. The hooked nose is a bash at Jewish people. The pitchfork, I don't know how much I put into this. I hear it is a stab at Muslims for something, but what I'm actually going to reference is Poseidon's trident, which was the symbol of naval power for ancient Greece, and would actually make much more sense in my mind for them to add, because obviously the beautiful, shining, highest-ranking angel of God didn't have a red pitchfork for no reason. However, the addition to counter Poseidon or Neptune, pagan gods of the sea, who carried the giant trident, makes a lot of sense once you actually put that into context. So what you see is a perpetual attempt to demonize paganism, because they have subjugated and made their place in the home of Strega. What they've done is assault the horn god, because he can be shown as the devil, because the devil's the bad guy, because the devil can be the bad guy, because the devil isn't weak, he's strong and he's scary and he's going to get you. Whereas women are just painted as weak-minded whores, because if you actually gave credit to the female deities, then you would give credit to women, which would give them power equal to a man, or in some cases greater, and then you would lose your male dominance. So we see a real gender struggle with the way they paint the Christian devil, and the way they paint the mother goddess, and the way they paint witches. Everything's lost in a cluster of trying to combine as many religions as possible to keep the Christian faith on top and to keep men on top. What we have now is essentially a movement of divine feminine power versus divine male power, versus both of them coexisting. in Wicca today, you see a lot of female dominance as sort of a retaliation to the male dominance over the history, well, no, over history in general, in the last 2,000 years. And women are seen as naturally more gifted and more apt in the craft in most circles. However, of course, this depends on where you practice and what you practice. You'll notice there are an incredibly high number of women in the craft and an incredibly high number of gay men, and also of lesbians. What you will not notice is the number of straight males is statistically much lower. And that is in main part because Wicca teaches that the feminine divine is the original creation. It's the original mother of everything, including men, including God, including what the male-dominated society has taught us to view as what is on top. I've gone on nearly an hour now. I feel like I've covered a lot of history, although not as succinct as I would like. For those of you who have stayed with this video, bless you, you're a brave soul for actually waiting this long. And if you have any questions, please raise them in class. I'll answer them to the best of my knowledge. And I believe I've touched on the main points of history so that now we have a pretty solid knowledge basis of where we are starting with this. I will oftentimes reference, when I get to my later videos, I will oftentimes reference other religions and other cultures which are now mixed into it. This is because, as I said, the mother goddess concept is not Diana specific. It is any female divine. The horn god concept is not specifically Kronos. It's not specifically Apollo or Pan. It's not the Christian ideal of the devil. It's not any of these things. It's the male divine. So what we're going to see is me referencing deities from cultures that are not Greece or Italy. And what I'm going to focus on in future videos is practitioner knowledge and personal experience, and defining terms like what I mean when I say energy, what I mean by practitioner magic or by ritual. I'll go into depth with a lot shorter time frames. And I feel like I probably could have shortened this video by not going on one or two of the rants I went on, but I feel like you really need a good solid knowledge base of where it began and why it occurred the way it did. If I've not been clear enough, let me know. And thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Have a blessed be. Whoa. I meant to say blessed be, and I started saying have a blessed day. Forget I did that. It was a little weird. Alright.